What's up, guys? This is Daniel from iapologia.com, where science, reason, and Christianity meet. Today I want to talk about an issue of slavery and the Bible. Now, I want to break this down. I'm not going to go through all the different issues with slavery in the Bible and with some of the concerns, but I do want to at least touch on it, so it's not like it's not going to be like a super deep conversation here. But I think there's certain things we do need to think about when we're talking about slavery in the Bible. So a lot of the concern that we see in our society today is that in the Old Testament especially, and even the New Testament, it doesn't seem like God opposed slavery like he should have. In fact, some places it sounds like he almost sanctioned it as almost like as a fine thing to do. So I want to just address that quickly, just make some distinctions. And then what we're going to do is once we make those distinctions, I think it'll help clarify some big picture items as we go forward here. All right, so let's start out here. First off, slavery. We need to make an important distinction here that when we're talking about slavery, we're talking about slavery in different time frames. When we're talking about antebellum slavery in the United States, mid-1800s, 1700s, we're talking about a different animal than New Testament slavery and Old Testament slavery. In some ways, Old Testament slavery is totally different. I mean, it's like totally different. You're comparing apples to oranges. When you're talking about New Testament slavery and antebellum slavery, there's still a lot of differences going on here, but there's a lot of similarities as well, I would say. First, let's just take off Old Testament right off the bat. We are not, as Christians, I'm a Christian, I'm not underneath the old law anymore. So no matter what happened in the old law, it doesn't really matter to me as a Christian because I'm not sanctioned under those rules. Jesus came with a new system that replaced the old, if you would. Now, there's still the idea that, hey, God's still God, and if he's the God of the Old Testament and God of the New Testament, which he is, then there's a concern with that. That's an interesting discussion, and I think it's easily tackled by the idea of a number of things here. Before I get to that, though, let's talk about why we have such an objection to slavery. It seems so wrong. Why does it seem so wrong? Well, it seems so wrong because actually the Bible seems to suggest it's wrong. It seems to go against the biblical ideas. And in other words, the problems we have with the Bible were caused by the Bible. The problems we have with Christianity were caused by Christianity. The problems we have with the church were caused by the church. And so as a society, we have been Christianized in a sense. And when we've been Christianized, we're a lot more sensitive to these different ideas. And when we see something that seems to go against our sensibilities, we're like, what's going on here? Slavery is one of those things. Slavery in general is a very natural enterprise for humans. And I'm not saying natural in the sense of I'm agreeing with it. That's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's very natural for humans to enslave other people. It's happened all through history. Almost every civilization, every culture has done it. The interesting thing is only the West has pretty much abolished slavery. And even nowadays, as we're still living, there's still cultures that still have slaves. And even though there is a huge, massive movement that's trying to object to it, saying, hey, this is not right. Why? Because of our biblical framework about human rights. So that's really important to note, is that this is a very natural enterprise. But there's other things that are natural too, like getting angry or killing people. Murdering is a natural thing. Getting drunk is a natural thing, or sexual immorality is a natural thing, but does not make those things right. I'm just saying that's natural. It's a natural tendency for us to do stuff like that. So the problems we have with the Bible were caused by the Bible. So we have to remember that we have issues because it does not seem to fit our natural or our sensibilities, of our moral sensibilities that we get from the biblical worldview. That's a very important point. Another important point is that we already said that Old Testament, New Testament slaveries have been different. Also, I want to notice, and this is very important for the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that regulation or restriction does not mean affirmation. the Old Testament, especially, even more so than the New, seems to regulate slavery. The New Testament seems to more restrict slavery, and from a biblical worldview, it's no affirmation. God did this a number of times. I can give you a number of examples, but one example that is really easy that is used a lot in different scenarios, just because in the Old Testament, God seemed to allow something does not make it right. The prime example is divorce and remarriage, or issues of sexuality in general, polygamy, divorce and remarriage. Those things were allowed, but they weren't God's optimal plan. He actually spoke against it, and he's like, you don't get divorced and you don't get remarried. But because of the hardness of man's heart, we see that God regulated those enterprises. So one thing that we have to remember is that we can say, oh, in the Old Testament, like, why couldn't God just say no more slavery at all? And we see a system where we actually did that. It's called, in the mid-1800s, during the Civil War. The Republican Party was formed as an anti-slavery party. That's the reason why a lot of the original blacks, the first blacks that were in politics were all in the Republican Party. It was the Republican Party that said, we don't want slavery anymore. And as a Democrats are saying, no, we want slavery, we want racism. They're the party of the KKK, the racism, Jim Crow laws, segregation, discrimination. It was the Democrat Party. Well, the Republican Party said, no, the blacks should be at the same level as whites. We're all human. Okay, so, but we saw this huge conflict arise from it because Republicans said no more, slavery. We saw this big war. That's what happens when we go with the biblical worldview of saying, this is how we do it. I mean, we see the same thing going on today, the exact same issue with abortion. Abortion's murder. I don't have time to get into reasons why today, but it's murder. It's pure murder is taking the life of innocent, unborn human babies. But we know that there's a huge opposition to anybody trying to abolish the abortion industry, and so it's almost like another civil war type of thing going on in a country right now. So there's a reasons why God didn't just totally abolish slavery at one time, because he knew that because of man's heart. And so he just regulated and restricted it. And as you go through the Bible, actually, you notice that the restrictions and regulations seem to get tighter and tighter. At least that's how I read it. And I don't have enough time to get into the Old Testament right now because it's interesting how that the regulations seem to get a little more heavy if you do want to own this slave. Nor are we talking about Southern slavery. Southern slavery was very racist. It was picked out a very specific group of people, blacks, and said, hey, you are less than whites. There's white supremacy. It's kind of the opposite of nowadays with this whole race wars of different types of ethnic groups are more supreme to even whites and Asians. A lot of times in colleges, you have affirmative action where if you're black or if you have some other background, you have a better chance of getting in a position than, let's say, a white or an Asian person would. That's racism. It's the same thing that was happening in the past, except for it's kind of on a reverse, but it's not really reverse because it's still a racism, and racism is racism no matter what you say, however you look at it. Okay, so I want to just kind of recap that. We're under a new law. Southern racism is not the same as biblical racism. Three totally different things going on there. New Testament, Old Testament, and Southern slavery. All different animals, if you want to think of it that way. Regulation does not mean affirmation. God regulated a lot of things. He restricted a lot of things, but it doesn't mean that he affirmed it like this is a good thing. And those are some of the big items that we really want to get into. In the New Testament specifically, there seemed to be this idea that, why didn't Paul cry out harder against the slavery that was going on, especially in the church? Well, he kind of did. And There's a number of situations where he did in the Bible. Onesimus and Philemon, if you remember that story, where Paul pretty much tells Philemon, is like, hey, you better treat your slave as a brother. It's like, release him. That's pretty much what he's calling for him to do that. Okay. We can read other places in the New Testament where Paul is telling people, slaves, that they need to respect and obey their master, just as they would obey God. But on the other hand, he talked about to Christian masters, let's say slave owners, if you want to think of it that way, even though it wasn't the same type as a southern slave owner. He said, you treat them fair and square, and don't have preferences. He said all men are equal in that sense. He said we should be treating men with fairness and not preferring one person over another. Everyone is our brother. There is no one race, or there's no, just because you have more money or more prestige does not make you a better person. If you read the New Testament, it talks about those types of things. Also in the New Testament, there's another factor that not only that Paul did call it out, but he really couldn't do more than what he did. What he said already was quite radical, very radical. If the Christian church would have rose up against slavery, again, would get something like the Civil War, except for it wouldn't be the Civil War. Christianity was this tiny little group that was microcosmic group that was compared to all of Rome. It was a little ant, and they could not fight against Rome even if they wanted to. I mean, Judaism was huge. I mean, the religion of Judaism was much, much bigger than the Christian religion. And even they could not fight against Rome. Rome would actually demolish their Jerusalem a few years after Christ, about 40 years after Christ died. So, because the Jews revolted. So even the Jews did not have the power to revolt against the culture of the Roman Empire. What's interesting, though, is that the Christians took a very different tactic, something that Jesus and the apostles seemed to really promote, and that was change from the inside out. Jesus talks about this. The Old and New Testament actually talk about that. You need to change from the inside out. And so instead of going to war from the external, as I go to the war internal, change your own life and then let that change the lives of people around you, and the lives of people around you, and you can help change the lives of people around you guys. So think about it as you changing your life, and you can change your family or affect your family, and your family can impact the culture and the town that you live in, and the town and you and your family can impact the nation. And that's what the Christian church did. It took many, many years, but it was a very slow process, but it was a very powerful process when individuals stepped up to the plate. There's another thing too. Was that they thought that especially the church, they had an eternal focus, not a focus of the earth. They weren't focused on the temporal. They weren't focused on the terrestrial. They were focused on eternity. Neither were they focused on their monetary success. They weren't focused on their own ease and their own happiness in the materialistic sense. They were focused on Christ and keeping Christ as the center of their focus. That's huge to remember as well. There's also this idea that Jesus modeled where there's this strange, really, really crazy, how should I say, crazy view that there is strength and weakness. A lot of times we assume this today, but Jesus modeled this on the cross, that because he died, he was weak. He never really took up a sword and killed someone, but his movement changed the world. And how did he do that? By being weak. And so it's this idea of strength and weakness that the world never really knew before. It's like Jesus comes along and is like, hey, let's do. I mean, that's the reason why he turned the world upside down, because he did everything topsy-turvy. Like, this doesn't make sense in how humanity does stuff. So there's strength and weakness. I kind of told you how that Paul neutered the whole idea of slavery, in the sense that the slave owner was supposed to treat their fellow slaves, their fellow man, with dignity and respect, and even I'm gonna take that now a step farther. I'm just add one more point to that, that it wasn't just treat them equal, but Paul commanded, and Jesus did too, where that you're supposed to not just treat your brother just as good as yourself and equal with yourself, but better than yourself. And if your slave was your brother, which he is or she is, then that person is supposed to be treated better. And in fact, you're not even just supposed to just treat them better. You're supposed to love them as you loved yourself. And in fact, Jesus says that we should love our brother as much as Jesus loved the church. And if that's the case, then we need to give our life for each other, which pretty much says, okay, yeah, you're a slave owner, but what does that mean? Nothing. It just took away the meaning totally. It's like, you have no more authority than anything else. Everyone work together, be kind to each other, treat each other on the same plane, Yes, if you're a slave, if you are an employee, if you want to think of it in today's term, obey your employer. But employer, you don't think of yourself as some sort of cool hotshot. Be nice to them. Treat them fair and square, and don't think that you are some sort of Superman or Superwoman or something like that. So that's one of the applications I think we can come away with this. The second thing, I think I want to kind of wrap this up here. So that's just kind of for us. The second thing I think we need to really realize and think about is that we need to have these types of thoughts and explanations about how the Old Testament, New Testament, and the Southern slavery and antebellum slavery interact, because they get challenged in today's culture. Like, well, why are you Christians? Why does the Bible seem to say that slavery is a good thing? We need to have answers. And I think those are really, really good to have those answers for people who have objections to Christianity. So I think that's going to wrap it up. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe to this channel. I'd love to have you on board. I don't do a lot of these videos, but I'd like to do more of them. If you did find this helpful, feel free to comment below. Feel free to start a discussion. I'd love to have you on board. Feel free to check out my website, iapologia.com. You can go to my Facebook page. It's iApologia Facebook page. I have a Twitter account, iApologia Twitter account. It's Apologia with an I in front of it, not just Apologia. Also, I do have a separate page, Facebook page and Twitter page, that is focused more on the political arena. So you can check that out as well. It's called Liberty Bomb, which I post a lot more of the concepts to do with politics and religion and liberty and justice and those types of issues. It's not so much just telling you the latest news, even though I do share some of the news items from different news sites, but also it's more like, let's look at the big picture about like abortion and the social issues, about Marxism and things like that, which I really focus on. So again, this is Daniel from iApologia. Feel free to check us out. Feel free to like and subscribe again. You have an amazing day. Great to be with you. Fare you well.